Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm here with Nick Danforth, who is our Senior Policy Analyst on Turkey. And obviously we're going to be talking about the Turkey elections, which just happened yesterday. So Nick, what are the top takeaways from that election that just happened?
The big takeaway is that Erdogan won. Not necessarily fairly, but he won.
Was that surprising?
Unfortunately, I don't think it was a huge surprise for a lot of people. There were some expectations that it might take him 2 rounds to win, that this was going to go into the beginning of July. In the end, he won in the first round.
So what does that say? I mean, since there was an expectation that it could go to 2 rounds, what does it say that he won in the first round?
Right, and that there had been, especially in the final days of the election, there had been a lot of enthusiasm about the opposition candidate. There was a lot of discussion that Erdogan, who previously seemed unassailable, might finally be challenged, might finally lose. There was a separate debate about what he'd do if he lost, whether he'd step down, but there was an assumption that he could actually lose. And the fact that they went into this election, he won by, if not a dramatic margin, a sizable margin, and that so far, it's worth being clear, it was by no means an even playing field. Erdogan controlled the media going into this election. One of the opposition candidates was in jail. There were threats made against other opposition candidates. There were opposition candidates who'd hold rallies where the local government would turn off the electricity. And yet, so far it seems, despite widespread concerns, there hasn't been concrete proof of actual election irregularities, of fraud the day of the election. The opposition has conceded the election. And so that's, it's proof, once again, that for all the frustration with Erdogan amongst the opposition, even amongst many within his own party, his support remains very real.
So what does this mean for Turkey going forward?
A lot of what happens going forward depends on how the opposition responds. As I said, there was enormous hope, there was enormous enthusiasm, there were huge rallies for the opposition candidate going into this. The question is what happens to that enthusiasm. Do people, in the face of this electoral defeat, simply give up? Do they resign? You talk to a lot of people in Turkey who are trying to make plans to leave the country, or simply hunkering down for a decade of authoritarian rule. Or are people energized? Do people really feel like the possibility for change is still there? Are you going to see a more aggressive opposition? Are you going to see people go out into the streets if there are further abuses of power on the government side? Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind about Erdogan too is that he's an authoritarian, but he wants Turkey to be as democratic as possible, providing he can still run it. He's been very eager to maintain a veneer of democracy. With this election, he's been able to. The fact that there wasn't blatant fraud means that that veneer is still there. And I think what a lot of people looking at this are asking is, how long can that veneer last?
And so what does this mean for US-Turkish relationships, which have been sort of on the rocky side recently? So, he won. What does it mean?
US-Turkish relations have been strained, and I'm afraid after the election they're going to continue to be strained. There are some people thinking that Erdogan might turn over a new leaf, that he might be more reasonable and accommodating in victory. So far, there's little evidence of that from the last 16 years of Erdogan and from his comments immediately after the election. I think Erdogan is going to continue to be Erdogan with all the frustrations that brings with it. Again, I think it's worth pointing out, you don't want to make a caricature of him. He doesn't want to have bad relations with the West. He wants to have good relations with the West, but on his terms. And I think in victory, he's going to feel that his approach, his defiant, combative, aggressive approach has been vindicated both at home and abroad. You see this real sense, talking to people in Turkey, reading op-eds from Turkey, that things like Turkey's invasion of northern Syria, of Afrin, forced the United States to take Turkey seriously. You see this sense, people saying very explicitly after the election, look, now it's time for the Europeans and the Americans to realize that Erdogan is here to stay. They tried to get rid of him, they failed, now they have to deal with him. I think if this is the attitude that Erdogan brings to bilateral relations, that frustrations will continue.
Any silver linings?
No, I don't. A lot of people have been trying to find them. It's very difficult for me. The one But to find any silver lining, I think you have to go in a much larger historical context and say, I did my dissertation on Turkish democracy in the 1950s. And when Turkey held its first democratic election in 1950, a lot of people were surprised. American observers were surprised. People in Turkey were surprised. No one thought this was going to happen. And from then on, Americans at least, were happy to see Turkey was democratic. But through a series of coups, through a series of other setbacks, the attitude towards Turkish democracy was always kind of, it's good for the Middle East. It was held to a slightly lower standard. I think the one thing you can say, and it's a tribute to the struggle that people in Turkey have given over the last half century for a democratic future, is that we got to a point in the 2000s where the expectation for Turkey wasn't just that it would be a Middle East democracy, but that it would be a real consolidated liberal democracy. And those hopes have clearly been disappointed, but that remains, Turkey's been able to set that as the benchmark for itself. And you sometimes hear people in Turkey say, why does everyone criticize Erdogan as a dictator so much more than Sisi in Egypt, for example, when Sisi's clearly much worse? And people do criticize Sisi, of course, but I think it's fair to point to the double standard there, but it's worth mentioning that's a double standard in Turkey's favor. That's a double standard that exists because people really expected more from Turkey. And those expectations, those hopes have been disappointed now, but we continue to hope for the future.
Thank Nick. And thank you for joining us at the Bipartisan Policy Center.